Our next session is with Bas, and I'm going to mess this up as well. So hopefully you can correct me when you join on. But Bas Dijkstra, and what fascinates me about this session is that it's kind of a continuation of what Goodness was just talking about, right, around test automation. And you have had, I was stalking your LinkedIn profile a little bit, and you've got over 2 decades, it looks like, of test automation engineering experience. So I'm really interested to hear this session and better understand how we enable some of what Goodness was talking about through automation and through tools versus just kind of best practices and processes.
Thank you so much, Christine. And by the way, you did very well on pronouncing my last name. So hats off to you. I've heard it butchered way worse. So absolutely well done. And thank you so much for that introduction.
Welcome.
And I want to just be very picky and correct you. I don't have 2 decades yet. I'm closing in on 2 decades, but I'm not there yet. I hope to get there very soon. But thank you very much for that introduction. And what I'm going to talk about today is, I'm not just going to talk about it, but I'm going to actually show you how to implement some of those how to actually practice some of those things when we're talking about API security and when we talk about API testing. And the reason why I do this, let me for now just briefly maximize this. The reason why I'm doing this is because I'm in the testing profession, and there's a lot of people in testing that are still very, very distant from APIs in general, and definitely in API security testing. They see it as difficult, something they don't understand, something they have no knowledge of, no experience with. And they say, well, I think I'll just leave that to the experts. Let's an API expert, an API security expert come in. And I want to debunk some of that, maybe that attitude or that wariness of, API security, that's difficult, that's very technical, and they see all these hackers do all of these very complicated things. But actually, there's a lot that we can do as testers with tools, but the most important tool here is our own mind, a little bit of creativity and some common sense. So what I wanted to do today is just give you an example of what security testing on APIs might look like, some things to get started. It doesn't have to be very super technical, but there's with just, again, some common sense and a little bit of knowledge about how APIs work, there's already so much information, so much valuable information that you can get very early on in the process. This is just a screenshot of the site, by the way, of the API side. What I found a little bit interesting and also a little bit scary was that there's all these roles involved, but where are the testers? I think this is very telling of how a lot of people in the testing space look at APIs and API security. They say, well, we don't touch that. We don't do that. We don't know anything about that. And again, that's why I appreciated being on this conference, being on this session, because I think it's super important. I think, and I wanted to show that it isn't that scary. And again, with a lot of common sense, with a bit of common sense and a little bit of knowledge about APIs, there's already a lot of stuff that we can do. I'm actually not going to talk about automating things a lot. Sure, we need tools to support our testing, which is my definition of automation. But I want to talk about exploratory testing. And basic exploratory testing is performing experiments on software and observing the results, learning from the results, and then let those results guide you in further diving into, what might go wrong here? Or is there a problem here? So that's in a very, very tiny nutshell what exploratory testing is. So this is opposed to script-based automation where you write everything you're going to do in your testing up front. So again, I promise this was not just going to be me talking about exploratory security testing. I actually want to perform some tests. Of course, to do that, I'll need an API. What I've got here is admittedly the world's least secure online bank. This is Parabank. Parabank has a graphical user interface, but Parabank also has an API, and that API is documented in this Swagger document. And so I do quite a bit of API testing, training, and I'm starting to involve security testing and exploratory security testing in there more and more often. And what I do, so this is where it starts with the specification. What's in there? What's in this specification that you think, as a tester, might lead to problems? It's just have a look at the operations, have a look at the data that the API exposes, have a look at the operations that the API exposes. Are there any endpoints in there, any operations in there that you think, well, maybe it's a good idea to not expose these to the public? So again, admittedly, this is the world's worst online bank. It's also not an actual bank, by the way. In terms of security, so just an example is we have some endpoints where we can do stuff directly on a database. I don't think this is a very good idea to expose these kinds of things. And again, this is a very extreme example, but again, for me, security looks at what's available, what operations are available, or what endpoints are available that you might want to leave unexposed to the public. I know Goodness just talked about shadow APIs and those APIs that are there but that are not documented. So I want to start with what is documented, and we'll go into what is not documented in a moment. But this is where it starts. So what is there that should not be there? This is specification-based testing, inspection, and just good old question asking, which is what we are in the profession of, asking lots of questions as testers. So that's where it starts for me, exploring those API specifications and having a look at, well, what operations are better left not exposed or not in the API at all. But the interesting thing is, and that's where we get into the truly exploratory part of our API testing in general and our API security testing specifically, is what are the things that are not in the specifications. So there's probably a lot of people in API design and development who thought long and hard about what the contract should look like, what the security message should look like. But for us as testers, and especially when we do exploratory testing, for me, it's all about what's not in the specifications. So what problems can we find that are undocumented, that are maybe also unknown, but that are definitely there and that pose a security threat to our application, to our platform, to our company through the APIs that we expose. So I need a guide. So it helps so exploratory testing is different from just randomly clicking and sending payloads to endpoints and all kind of stuff. So we need some kind of guideline that can be a heuristic, that can be just prior experience. But one resource that I truly recommend every tester who wants to break into API security testing to explore is this OWASP API Security Top 10. For those of you who are not familiar with this top 10, I take it most of you are, but for those of you who aren't, it's a list of the most common API level security vulnerabilities published each year by the OWASP Foundation. So it's an API specific variation on the OWASP Security Top 10. And this for me is a great starting point to have a look at what's the API doing that it probably should not do. And one of the things that I tend to, so I don't, so it is a top 10, so it is a ranked list. I'm not going to go through all 10 of them because, first of all, there's no time, and second of all, not all of them are the best starting point, in my opinion, maybe. So I just want to go quickly through 3 of them. And the first one is broken authentication, which is basically how well is authentication implemented. Can the do people really need to truly authenticate themselves through before they can access endpoints and access resources, access data? So in this case, this API already fails horribly because, for example, if I want to retrieve the details of an account with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I have no authentication at all, and I'm still able to retrieve the data from this endpoint. So again, this is a demo, so it's not, but this is just a very first basic check. Well, even if the application or the API specification says, well, I need some kind of authentication before you can communicate with the API, just start with what happens if I don't supply those authentication details? What happens if I supply an invalid token, an expired token, no token at all? If you have credentials based, what happens if I specify incorrect credentials or no credentials at all, as I do in this case? How does the API handle that? Is that authentication that we thought was implemented, is that well and truly implemented? So that's a very, very quick starting point for it, because that gives you a good first idea about how seriously the API designers and developers actually took the security of the API that they said was so secure. The next one that I want to briefly highlight is broken function level authorization. For those of you not too familiar with this, it's so if my documentation, so for example, I can get account. So this tells me I can retrieve an account by its ID through an HTTP GET. What's not documented in here, what's typically not documented, is how does the API behave if you try to perform other types of operations than just retrieving account details? So what happens if I try to delete an account or update an account? And especially in terms of bank, it sounds very tempting to see if we can try and update the balance of our account, for example. So let me quickly copy this because I think that got lost. So if I want, instead of a raw JSON, instead of a balance of 0, so I have an account 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 belonging to a customer, and let's say what happens if I try to update that balance. Let's see what happens. So this is a very quick check, a very quick investigation into how. So this is undocumented behavior, but what happens if I try to do this? Now, in this case, our API tells me that this method is not allowed, which tells me, well, at least they thought of they implemented some security measures. Let's see what happens if I delete it. That also tells me this is a method that's not allowed. So again, this is just using a bit of common sense and just some creative thinking about, well, this is the behavior regarding a certain endpoint or a certain piece of data that's documented. But what happens if I try and perform other types of operations on there? So instead of just retrieving data, what happens if I try to update that data or just delete that data, delete that account in this case? The last one that I wanted to quickly highlight is, and there's a reason it's the number one, because it's one of the most common API security vulnerabilities, that's broken object level authorization. So in this case, for this example, I have a bank, let me log in as customer John. And if I want to open a new account through the UI, so there's this business rule that we need to deposit at a minimum of $100, and that's deducted from an existing account. And this list of accounts that you can choose from only shows you the accounts that are associated with John. So through the UI, there's no way to make that deduction, make that deposit from an account that's not associated with the currently logged in user. But what about the API? So there's another user in here. He's called Parasoft. So this Bob has an account number 13455. Let's remember that for a moment and log back in as John. So that 13455 is not in this list. So through the UI, it's impossible to open a new account as John and deduct the deposit from an account that's not associated with John. But does the API hold up to those security standards? Is that something that maybe possible through the graphical through the API interface? So, sorry. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to post that. This is the API call that's being made by the UI. It's creating a new account for the customer IDs. This is customer John. The new account type is 0, which is a checking account. And that from account ID is, so this is a previous one. This from account ID is an account that's not associated with John. So as we saw through the graphical user interface, John doesn't have access to that account. So he cannot deposit from an account that's not associated with the currently logged in user. However, if we do this through the API level, we clearly see that there's definitely a broken object level authorization issue here, because if I do this through the API, the API tells me, oh, well, I've created a new bank account, 13566. And if we look at the accounts overview, we have a new account, 13566, that has $100, but poor Bob is out of $100 now, because if we look at their history and we now see a debit, so a deduction from his account, even though the UI doesn't. So these are some very straightforward experiments that we can perform as testers just by being a little bit creative, thinking about what might happen if we do this, even if that graphical user interface prevents us from doing so. Are we absolutely sure that that same API security violation is impossible? Is my API just as secure as the UI that gives me access to that API? So this is a prime example of what the OWASP calls broken object level authorization. So even though the UI prevents us from doing so, the API definitely gives us access to resources, and in this case, a very specific resource, being money, that we are not authorized to access. Again, I could go on with more experiments and more things to test, and given the very weak security of this API and this bank application in general, there's probably lots of other things that we can find. These are just 3 examples, but I hope that it has given you an idea for those of you who are maybe a little bit unknown or relatively inexperienced in the area of API security testing, just to give you a hint or a preview of just an idea of that it's not that difficult to get started. So what you need is an API that you want to explore, that you want to test. You need a tool to interact with. So I chose Postman as a tool to interact with that API. That could be any tool, really. Just pick one that you're familiar with, that you find easy to use, be it a code-based library or a low-code tool like Postman. And again, the most important tool here is a creative mind and common sense, really. So those are, and that's again, that's the beauty of being a good tester. And that's what we've got. That's what we can bring to the table as testers. Creative thinking, asking the interesting questions, and then performing experiments that can potentially expose these API security vulnerabilities. There's lots of other things that we can do as well, other than those things that are listed in the OWASP API Security Top 10, things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, just plain old parameter fuzzing, parameter overloading, those kinds of things. So those are all different examples of security tests, security testing experiments that we don't need a whole lot of technical proficiency for, or a deep technological or programming skills. It's just something we can do with a tool, access to an API, and again, creative thinking and a lot of common sense. So that's the message that I wanted to convey today in this talk and live demo, that with a bit of curiosity and common sense and a bit of guidance. So for example, from that OWASP API Security Top 10, everybody can perform API, or everybody can start assessing the security of the APIs that they are developing. Thank you so much. Christina, back to you. I think we are right on time, and we have a couple of minutes for questions.
We do, and I have a couple of questions. So, great talk, by the way, and I love the practical, hands-on lab format of it, because I think it really helps to take kind of the esoteric notions of how we test for things and make it a lot more real for us. Do you have sort of a short list of, if there were something that are the must-haves in your API security testers, bag of secret tricks or weapons, what's in your toolkit that you think every API security tester should be?
Again, it's that common sense, because again, a lot of the things that we do or can do in API security testing are not that different from what we do as testers when we interact with an application through a graphical user interface, which is an interface that most people are much more familiar with. But a lot of those things, so it's in a lot of testing interviews and guidebooks is like these questions of 2,000 ways to test a login form, basically. And all of those things, all 2,000 of those testing IDs, you can apply on APIs as well, because again, it's what most of it boils down to is how does the recipient of that data, of that input, react to that input. And then again, I was more recently than you might think made aware of that API, OWASP API Security Top 10, and I think it's a great way to get started with, and again, maybe not all of the items, but definitely some of them. Just understand them as testers and try and go a bit beyond all the terminology that's explained by OWASP and that's written down by OWASP, but because most of these things, a lot of these things boil down to common sense. So I may be able to read data, but what happens if I try to update the data or to delete the data? Those kinds of things. Those are all experiments that a lot of testers are familiar with. It's just the interface that they're using is maybe new to them.
That makes sense. We had a comment from one of the viewers in the chat session as well, and said the same thing, right? Having ample common sense is very useful as an API pen tester here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yes, yeah, you are pen testing to some extent, but again, it's a lot of people, especially in the testing community, which is where I've been active at, that they still look at security testing. Oh, we leave that to the experts. We don't do that. We don't touch that. We know nothing of that. And that's what I try to debunk that myth a little bit, just by showing just how easy it is to get started. And is that a full-blown vulnerability scan on your API? No, maybe not, but it's a great way to find potentially interesting and very important information very quickly, which is what I think is great to have in any team.
No, I agree, and I think it's a good first step, right? And you're right that I think one of the things that we see on our at API Sec University, there's a deep dive pen testing course, right?
Yes.
And it's not easy. It's, it's a lot. And so I think sometimes instead of just starting in very practical ways and understanding how to do it, you don't have to go, I guess, the full blown route of trying to become a certified expert at API pen testing to be doing API security testing. And that's a great message.
Yeah. So yes, that's exactly the point I was trying to make. So it's well, I'm just going to stop talking because that was a wonderful summary.
No, I mean, I think it's a really important message though, because it can become overwhelming. You're right.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be that hard to just do something.
No, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we maybe don't need the full-blown pen testers, the super experts for.
Yeah, great point.
Exactly.
That was an awesome talk, Bas. Thank you so much. And we are on a lunch break officially now. So hopefully, well, probably dinner break for you. I'm not sure where you're joining us from. But
it's definitely dinner time, yeah.
Yeah. So wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is, go enjoy a break. I believe we are back here in